All right, everyone, get ready for a deep dive that takes us way back, like way back to the world before the Renaissance and scientific revolution.
Before TikTok and instant coffee, right?
Haha, exactly. We're talking about a time when things were drastically different, and thankfully, the source material you sent in, I think it's going to give us a pretty fascinating look at that world.
You're not kidding. Easy to forget, I think, just how different things were. It makes you realize that a lot of what we consider like basic common sense today, like questioning things, demanding evidence, that wasn't really encouraged back then.
Right. It wasn't like you could just Google something or fact check someone on Twitter.
Exactly. Okay, so let's see. These look like class notes. Social Studies 2201, specifically Unit 2, Notes 4.
And the title mentions the power of the church. Ooh, this is getting interesting. Where do we even begin with this?
Well, these notes focus on the period right before the scientific revolution, which is super important. I mean, you can't understand how drastically things changed unless you understand the world as it was first.
So, paint us a picture. What was life like back then?
Imagine, if you will, a world where the Catholic Church isn't just a religious institution, but basically the dominant force in every aspect of life. Politics, society, you name it, they had a say in it, even down to how people understood the universe.
Okay, so we're not talking just about going to church on Sundays here. This is serious power.
Oh, absolutely. And they weren't afraid to use it. Remember the term indulgences?
Vaguely. Remind me.
Just imagine being told you could basically buy forgiveness for your sins. That was the idea behind indulgences.
Wow, talk about a moral dilemma. And a lucrative business model, I'd imagine.
Oh, absolutely. The church, they were at the height of their power. They sold these indulgences as a way to, reduce your time in purgatory. And this was a time when, challenging the church's teachings could get you excommunicated.
Which basically meant what? Like being banned from church?
Think bigger. Excommunication was a huge deal back then. It meant being cut off from society, a terrifying thought for most people. So yeah, you did not want to get on the wrong side of the church.
It makes you realize just how different things were. Today, we can, debate the shape of the Earth online with strangers, and nobody bats an eye,
Right. And speaking of the Earth, the notes mention this thing called the geocentric view, the idea that the Earth was considered the center of the universe. And it really highlights how intertwined religious doctrine was with scientific understanding at the time.
So if the church said the Earth was the center of the universe, then that was that. No questions asked.
Pretty much. And this is where we really start to see how the lack of widespread literacy played a huge role in the church's dominance.
Because most people couldn't read the Bible for themselves.
Exactly. They had to rely on the church's interpretation of it, which conveniently often aligned with their own interests. No questioning allowed.
It's all starting to make sense now. This wasn't just about faith, it was about control. Control over knowledge, control over information.
100%. It's like we always say, knowledge is power.
Okay, so we've got this picture of a world completely shaped by the church, where people basically accepted the Earth was the center of everything. But these notes keep mentioning something called the scientific revolution. What exactly was that, and when did it all start?
Well, it's not like there was one specific date, But the scientific revolution, it was this huge shift, like an earthquake, shaking up everything people thought they knew about everything.
Sounds dramatic.
It really was. And those brave thinkers we mentioned earlier, they're the ones who set this revolution in motion. People like Copernicus.
Okay, yeah, he comes up in the notes. Copernicus. He was the one who said the sun was at the center, right?
Exactly. He was a Polish astronomer, and he basically turned the world upside down with his book on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres. That was a mouthful.
I bet. So in this book, he's the one who proposed the heliocentric model with the sun at the center of it all.
Precisely. And this wasn't just some abstract theory. I mean, it directly challenged the church's teachings. This was a big no-no back then.
Yeah, I can only imagine the church wasn't too thrilled about someone contradicting them like that.
You got that right. But here's the thing about the scientific revolution. It wasn't just about coming up with new ideas. It was about backing those ideas up with evidence. And that's where people like Galileo come in.
Ah, Galileo. Wasn't he the one with the telescope?
That's the one. He used this brand new invention to make actual observations of the stars and planets. And guess what? What he saw, it supported Copernicus's heliocentric model.
So he had proof. Did that change the church's mind?
Not exactly. In fact, they put Galileo on trial for his beliefs.
Seriously? Just for looking through a telescope?
Well, for daring to challenge their authority. Really, they saw this whole evidence-based thing as a threat to their power. you know?
Wow. So much for the church being open to new ideas.
It was a different time, that's for sure. But the thing is, once these new ideas, these new ways of thinking were out there, it was like opening a Pandora's box. You couldn't just stuff them back in.
So the cat was out of the bag, so to speak. But how did these new ideas actually spread? I mean, we're talking about a time before the internet, before printing presses even, right?
It was a slow burn, for
Yeah.
sure. But ideas, they have a way of spreading regardless. And this new way of thinking, this emphasis on reason and observation, it started to seep into different areas. Philosophy, art,
Mm-hmm.
even politics.
It's like a ripple effect, one change leading to another.
Exactly. The notes mentioned something called rationalism. Basically, this was the idea that reason, logic,
Hmm.
those were the keys to understanding the world, not just blindly accepting what you're told.
Makes sense.
Think of René Descartes. He was a big name in this movement. I think, therefore I am. Ring a bell?
Oh, yeah. So instead of blind faith, it's about thinking critically, analyzing, questioning everything.
Exactly. And then there's empiricism, the idea that knowledge comes from experience, from observation. Think about scientists conducting experiments, collecting data.
Not just sitting around in a room thinking about stuff, but actually going out there and testing those thoughts.
Right. And this shift, this move toward reason and evidence, it wasn't just a phase. It completely transformed the way people saw the world.
It's like we were saying earlier, control over information, that's real power.
Absolutely. And with the scientific revolution, that control started to slip away from the church and into the hands of, well, anyone curious enough to look through a telescope or ask a question.
Which is a perfect segue, I think, into those video links you mentioned earlier. They seem to pick up right where these notes leave off, especially the one titled God and the Scientists.
Let's dive into those next, because those videos add a whole other layer to this story, especially when it comes to the church's reaction to all of this.
All right, so we've gone from a world ruled by the church to the rise of reason and observation during the scientific revolution. Let's talk about those videos you mentioned, especially that one, God and the Scientists. It sounds juicy.
It really dives into how people reconcile these new scientific discoveries with their faith. Because it's not like everyone just suddenly stopped believing in God.
Right, it's like, how did they square those two things in their minds? Faith and science. It seems like a tough thing to do.
It was. And the video does a good job of showing those different perspectives. For some, like Isaac Newton, for example, studying science, it was like a way of getting closer to God. Like they were uncovering the order and the laws that he had set in motion.
So instead of contradicting their faith, science actually reinforced it.
Exactly. For them, it was all part of the same big picture. But, not everyone saw it that way. And that's what makes this period so interesting to study. It wasn't just this clean break from the old ways of thinking.
It's like trying to fit together two puzzle pieces that don't quite match, but somehow it still works.
I like that analogy. And that's really the main takeaway, I think. History, it's messy. It's not always black and white. There are nuances, different perspectives, and it's important to keep that in mind as we learn about this stuff.
Absolutely. And speaking of different perspectives, what about that other video? 25 Reasons to Not Live in the Middle Ages. I've got to know, is it as funny as it sounds?
It's pretty entertaining, I'm not going to lie. But it also makes you think. Because, yeah, we often romanticize the past, but when you really stop and think about what daily life was like back then.
No indoor plumbing, no antibiotics. I'll take my chances with the modern world.
Right, and that's another important point, I think. As much as we can learn from history, it's also a reminder of how far we've come and to appreciate the progress we've made as a society.
Absolutely. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Any last words of wisdom for our listeners before we go?
Just keep asking questions, keep learning, and who knows, maybe you'll make a groundbreaking discovery of your own someday.
And maybe someone in the future will be studying your class notes, wondering what it was like to live in the year 2024.
Now that's a thought.
Isn't it? That's all the time we have for today, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this journey through time, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.